So this article was reported by the BBC, and it also turns up in the Jewish Chronicle. And it's about a now 21-year-old woman who at the age of 11 was seized by Islamic State and sold to various buyers. In 2015, she was sold to an ISIS fighter who was a Palestinian. Then, after he was killed in 2019, his relatives took her to Turkey, then to Egypt, and finally to Gaza. And in not one of those, I have to say it, Muslim countries could she have been freed, and she was kept in Gaza as a slave, although the entire UN was there. And had it been functioning properly, she could have turned herself and the children she was forced to have over to them. But she couldn't do that because it wasn't unacceptable to be a sex slave. It was just normal. I'm Granniopteryx. I'm on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds. So this is the article in the Jewish Chronicle. She said she tried suicide many times. She was kidnapped at the age of 11 and then taken to Gaza. You see, surrounded by people who just regarded her as a slave, and that was cool with them. Fauzia was raped by ISIS terrorists before being moved to Raqqa. That's in Syria. And then she was sold in 2015 to a terrorist who had come to fight for ISIS. She remained captive in Syria for years, during which time she had 2 children from the pregnancies that resulted from the rapes. After her abductor died in 2019, I believe he was killed fighting, the Palestinian terrorists' relatives smuggled her along with her children to Turkey and then through tunnels in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula to Gaza. These are the sort of people with whom the Israelis are supposed to negotiate. Okay, one of their sons had gone rogue and gone to fight for ISIS. That's the story we're fed, and it had nothing to do with them. So when they found the woman that he'd kept in slavery, did they then turn her over to the UN or back to her family? No. They actually kidnapped her again, and they took her to Turkey, where she knew she wasn't going to get any help, and then to Egypt, where she knew she wasn't going to get any help, and then through those tunnels that the Americans kept telling the Israelis not to go near, between Egypt and Gaza. And then she was in Gaza. And if you ever hear of anyone talking about Gaza being the biggest prison camp in history, it is, but for people like Fauzia, not for the rest. They were slaveholders. The family was slaveholders, and the people, the neighbours, everybody who knew she was a slave, they were, as I said, cool with that anyway. So there's this guy, Steve Maman, a Canadian, a Jewish Canadian benefactor who rescued her. He told the Jewish Chronicle, Fauzia, is strong, but she's having a hard time. She's thinking about her children. But they're Hamas children. There's no way they would have let her take them. And this is the BBC's take on it. A Yazidi woman who was kidnapped aged 11 has been rescued. They don't mention that this is by a Jewish Canadian. After more than a decade in captivity there, officials from Israel, the US and Iraq said. And here are some Yazidi people running away ahead of ISIS at the time that was about to take them over. Some of the Yazidi girls and women who later escaped from captivity described being openly sold or handed over into sexual slavery as gifts to IS members. The Islamic State group is believed to have killed more than 3,000 Yazidis and captured 6,000 others in total. And if you want to hear about ethnic cleansing or genocide, it's this. And it's no use saying, well, that was ISIS, now we're talking about Gaza, because it's Gaza as well. Now, what I'm going to do to explain to you why Muslim society is so, please forgive the expression, is so fucked up, I'm going to make up a little story for you. And even though I'm making it up, it's as true to life as a report of a speech in Hansard. The story, Hansard is the record of the discussions and debates in Parliament, by the way. So the story is going to be about a girl living in the 7th century in a village in what is now Syria, and I'll call her Suhaila. And I'm going to slip backwards and forwards in time to illustrate what happened to a lot of Suhailas and to Saras, and later on, when India fell to the Mughals, to the Samiras over the past 1400 years. ISIS formed itself as an exact copy of the early Muslim hordes that swept over the Middle East in the 7th century. So we can see in them exactly what happened in the 7th century. In both cases, they spread very quickly, not through peace and love, but by making themselves into juggernauts of brutality. Now, in the 20th century, other armies managed to get their act together to stop them. There are still some hanging around, by the way, but mostly in small pockets. 1400 years ago, it was a different story. When Suhaila was 9 years old, her village was surrounded, invaded, and then pillaged by the Muslim conquerors. Suhaila saw her father and older brothers murdered. Her mother was either killed if she was too old or taken as a slave. It makes no odds. After seeing her father's head rolling on the ground and hearing her mother's anguished wails as she's dragged off, Suhaila will never see her mother again, nor will she ever see her younger brothers, who would have been taken as slaves and possibly as future Muslim warriors. She was completely stripped from her family and of her clothes, probably. She herself was sold, let's say, to a 50-year-old man who raped her on the same night that he bought her. And this happened because, as far as the Muslims were concerned, it wasn't unacceptable. It was just normal. Back in the 7th century, Suhaila won't be rescued. For the rest of her life, she will be beaten to keep her in line. She'll be locked up, probably with a harem of other female slaves, all of who will have had similar horrifying experiences. They will all be tortured by PTSD. Some of them might actually be mad. And every one of them would have to jockey with the others for the tattered remains of opportunity or status, whatever would be left in their restricted lives, and with predictable results of bullying and hysteria. Now, assume that Suhaila actually had a child. A girl child might simply be killed straight off as soon as it was born, but even if not, it would certainly be sold off as a slave when she was around 5 years old. There are 5-year-old slaves in the Arab world even today. And if you don't believe me, look at a court case in Germany of an ISIS woman. They say she's a German, but she went to become a member of ISIS, who killed a 5-year-old slave by chaining her up in the sun and letting her die of sunstroke and dehydration. Anyway, If she had a boy, the boy would be taken from her to be castrated and used as a slave, or to be indoctrinated and used as arrow fodder in the Muslim armies that were continuously expanding in search of resources and, of course, of more slaves. So here you have a girl who saw her family murdered, who's raped regularly, who's locked up, and who might bear children she will never see grow up. What sort of a mother is this girl going to be? Well, she's going to be a bloody awful mother. And her daughter would be a bloody awful mother as well. And so would her granddaughter, and so on. And this persisted through the generations of Muslim society because it wasn't unacceptable. It was just normal. It's true that by the 11th century Muslim society had settled down a bit, but you see the template was set and it persists until today. Muslim society is far more violent than any you'll see in the West, and it has a radically different attitude to human relationships. Domestic violence is routine and accepted, and domestic murders are more common than any of us like to believe. It persists even in Muslim families here in the UK, among people who were born here and who've gone to British schools. Over in Muslim societies, bullying is an institution that's so deeply ingrained, there's even a sort of socially recognised hierarchy of it. And the system is, you bully anyone, you can get away with bullying. Husbands bully wives, children and servants. Wives bully children and servants. Children bully each other and servants. And don't think that those husbands get off scot-free, because in turn they're bullied by men higher up the chain of command than themselves. It's just taken for granted that that is how things work, because it isn't unacceptable in Muslim societies. It's just normal. The daughter of President Sadat, the president of Egypt, was beaten ferociously by her husband. And when she complained about it to her father, President Sadat, the president of all Egypt, he told her to be more submissive to her husband and not to irritate him. It didn't even occur to him to tell her husband that this behaviour was unacceptable, because it wasn't unacceptable. It was just normal. So was it a surprise there was a slave being held by a family in Gaza? Poor old Gaza, where everyone is oppressed and poor and saintly. All the neighbours would have known a family next door had at least one slave. A girl who'd seen her family murdered and whose children were taken from her. But no one said anything, because it wasn't unacceptable in Muslim society. It was just normal. Till next time. You can help my channel by subscribing and clicking the notification bell. That's quite important. And by sharing if you're so inclined. Links to my other channels and to donation methods are in the description. But the best way you can help is simply by clicking like and notify. Thank you.